All right, everybody. Mrs. Straub here. We are talking about the Cold War. The Cold War takes place after the end of World War II, and the Cold War lasts for about 45 years, from 1945 to 1991. But what was the Cold War? It is not a war that was very, very cold. All right, we're not talking literally chilly, like burr. The Cold War was a state of political and military tension after World War II between powers in the Western Bloc, known as the United States and its capitalist allies, and powers in the Eastern Bloc, the Soviet Union and its communist allies. So this is Western Bloc versus Eastern Bloc. This was the United States versus the Soviet Union. This was capitalism versus communism. Looking down here at this map, this is a map of the world. You've got red are the Warsaw Pact members. We're going to talk about the Warsaw Pact in a little bit. NATO members in the dark, dark blue, the United States, Canada, Greenland. The USSR is here, and they're a Warsaw Pact member. Western aligned and or its colonies. So these countries here in this medium colored blue are aligned with NATO members and they're aligned with each other. These are the colonies of these major countries or so territories. The pinkish is China. This is a communist country, but it's not aligned with the USSR. All right, this is Australia. So the Western Bloc is made up of the USA and NATO allies. The economic system in the Western Bloc is capitalism. The political system is democracy. The United States wanted to contain communism, so they pursued the policy of containment. Definition of containment was a strategy of keeping communism within its existing boundaries and preventing its further expansion. This policy meant the United States would support any nation facing an external or internal communist threat. Understanding containment is very, very key. Understanding the relationship between the United States and NATO, and that the United States and NATO allies were capitalist, democratic, and they make up the Western Bloc. Looking at the Eastern Bloc, we're talking about the Warsaw Pact allies, all right? So this is NATO versus Warsaw, all right? These are different alliances. So you've got the Warsaw Pact allies and the USSR. The economic system is the command economy. The political system is communism. We're going to talk about what a command economy is in a little bit. The USSR wanted to promote communism and spread these ideas to other countries. The promotion of communism was a strategy of expanding communism outside its existing boundaries. The policy meant the Soviet Union would support any nation facing external or internal aggression from the Western Bloc. All right, we are going to view this 7-minute video starting now.
Good grammar and spelling are important, but if you want to write essays that inspire, message.
The Cold War was a conflict that began at the end of the Second World War in 1945. The end of the war marked the end of the supremacy of Europe. Two powers took over. The United States and the Soviet Union, leading two blocs with their own alliances and satellite states. The so-called Western Bloc, capitalist, and the Eastern Bloc, communist. Why was it called the Cold War? Because neither of the two blocs ever took direct actions against the other. It wasn't a normal war, although there were derivative conflicts and subsidiary wars. The reasons for this conflict were essentially ideological, political, economic, and for propaganda purposes. The Soviet Union financed and supported revolutions and socialist governments, while the United States gave open support and propagated destabilization and coups in Latin America. The history of the Cold War starts before 1945, specifically in 1917. after the triumph of the Russian Revolution, from which Russia emerged as the first socialist country. This was one of the first events that provoked considerable erosions in Russian-American relations. The Soviets argued that capitalism must be overthrown by force and be replaced by a communist system. The American capitalists, after the outbreak of the revolution, helped the White Army during the Russian Civil War. Finally, the Red Army troops, led by Trotsky, claimed the victory. But let's go back to 1945. After the end of the Second World War, we need to remember that the Soviet Union and the United States had been allies to stop Hitler's plans. Before the war was over, they met in Yalta. Joseph Stalin, Winston Churchill, and Franklin D. Roosevelt as heads of government of the USSR, the United Kingdom, and the United States respectively. The Yalta Conference was followed by the Potsdam Conference, with Germany already totally defeated and Hitler dead. These conferences involved the division of Germany into 4 zones, one part for each country and one part for France. Issues of disarmament, demilitarization, the return of territories annexed by Germany, the hunting down of Nazi war criminals, and the creation of the United Nations were also discussed. The Soviets, after the war, had de facto occupied the areas of Eastern Europe that they had defended and liberated. To stop this Soviet expansion, the United States, with the Marshall Plan, helped Western Europe and the western part of Germany to get back to normal. With the Marshall Plan, the Americans gave enormous economic aid to Europe. The plan was operational for 4 years from 1948. The United States' objectives were to rebuild the areas destroyed by the war, eliminate trade barriers, modernize European industry, and make the continent prosperous again. All these objectives aimed to prevent the spread of communism, which had a large and growing influence in post-war Europe. The detractors of the Marshall Plan argued that this was an example of US economic imperialism. The United States promoted the founding of NATO, the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, an intergovernmental military alliance sealed in 1949. The organization was a system of collective defense, in which the member states agreed to defend any of their members if they are attacked by an external faction. The rival nations, to counteract the strength of this alliance, signed the Warsaw Pact in 1955. Finally, Berlin, Europe, and the world were divided by the Iron Curtain. This expression was coined by Churchill. In 1949, the Red Army of Mao Zedong was proclaimed winner of the Chinese Civil War, after defeating the Kuomintang nationalists, who were supported by the United States. The Soviet Union immediately establishes an alliance with the victors, who had created a new communist state called the People's Republic of China. The following year, Stalin was caught by surprise by the participation of US troops in the defense of South Korea, that had been invaded by the North Korean communists. The ceasefire came in 1953. Stalin had died that same year. He will be succeeded by Nikita Khrushchev. Let's go back to the Iron Curtain in Europe. In the 5 years after the Second World War, a total of 50 million people emigrated from east to west. This fact caused the Soviet bloc to carry out an effective emigration blockade in 1950. There was a very tight control of passports so that people couldn't go from one block to the other. The border in Berlin, a city that was divided, was a sieve, and many people left the communist side to go to the capitalist side. This led to the construction of the Berlin Wall in 1961. We must remember that Germany was divided after the war in 2 Germanys, the German Federal Republic with its capital in Bonn, and the German Democratic Republic with its capital in Berlin. This division of the world into 2 blocks was maintained because of the risk of the 2 powers annihilating each other in a nuclear war. This forced both sides to exercise great caution in the most conflictive areas. The conflict nearly erupted, but only once, after the overthrow of the military leader Batista in Cuba by Fidel Castro. The United States tried to carry out an invasion of Cuba, but failed. In 1962, the so-called missile crisis occurred when President Kennedy punished Cuba with the blockade of the Soviet ships that were carrying missiles that were directed against the United States. At the last moment, Khrushchev, head of the party and the Soviet government, gave in, and the ships changed course. The US had also entered the Vietnam War, which in the end turned out to be another hard setback in American history, where they experienced failure, exhaustion, and frustration. This conflict confronted the US and the government of South Vietnam on the one hand against North Vietnam and the communist guerrillas that acted in South Vietnam on the other. The war also ended up extending to Laos and Cambodia. The Cold War was also espionage, reciprocal inspections, conferences, crises, and diplomatic solutions. And let's not forget the space race, a competition between the United States and the Soviet Union that led to a display of power and muscle. The Russians put the Sputnik satellite into orbit in 1957. The Americans immediately responded with their Explorer 1 in 1958. It was a matter of prestige. When the Russians sent their first man into space, the Americans took their revenge by sending a manned spaceship to the moon. In 1980, Reagan won the election, promising to increase military spending and take on the Soviets wherever it was necessary. Both Reagan and the newly elected British Prime Minister, Margaret Thatcher, constantly denounced the communist ideology. Reagan called the Soviet Union the evil empire and predicted that communism would be left on the ash heap of history. In early 1985, Reagan's visceral anti-communism developed into a policy known as the Reagan Doctrine, in which, in addition to containment, he expressed the rights of the US to subvert and overthrow existing communist governments. Finally, in 1989, the Berlin Wall falls, which means the definite opening up of the borders between the two blocs, the dismemberment of the Communist bloc, and the end of the Iron Curtain and the Cold War. After the fall, the tension between the old communist countries and the capitalist countries would end up being diluted. In fact, at present, most of the states of the former communist bloc have embraced the policies and ideologies of the capitalist world.
Alright, there was a great deal of information in that video. We are going to cover a little bit of all of that you saw, so I understand if that felt a little overwhelming. This is a little bit of the video transcript that I'm going to read, and then you're going to have to answer a couple questions in the Ed puzzle. The Cold War was a conflict that began at the end of the Second World War in 1945. The end of the war marked the end of the supremacy of Europe. Two powers took over, the United States and the Soviet Union, leading two blocs with their own alliances and satellite states. The so-called Western Bloc were capitalists and the Eastern Bloc were communists. Why was it called the Cold War? Because neither of the two blocs ever took direct actions against the other. It wasn't a normal war, although there were derivative conflicts and subsidiary wars. Subsidiary wars means conflicts related to the competition between the USA and the USSR. The reasons for this conflict were essentially ideological, political, economic, and for propaganda purposes. The Soviet Union financed and supported revolutions and socialist governments, while the United States gave open support to capitalist countries. I'm going to have you answer the following three questions in the Ed puzzle. The Cold War took place after which war? 2. Which countries were the most powerful during the Cold War? How were those two countries different? And 3. Why was the Cold War called cold?